The Story of the Windlenot Museum. Chapter 6. Clues on Film. Richard Cale shivered as he recovered from the attack. He couldn't believe he had been so stupid. He fell for the very thing he had warned the others about. What made things worse was the fact that something told him to be wary of the candelabra earlier. He was then thankful when the shivering subsided, and he glanced at his reflection in the glass case in the room. He looked 20 years older than his actual age. It was then he noticed that Carl was patting him on the back, saying, "Richard, are you all right?" He half wanted to respond sarcastically, but decided not to. He then looked at Carl, and he could see concern in the man's eyes. "I'll be fine. Right after I catch those exupi. I have no desire to end up like the professor or the two missing teenagers. Besides, I don't think my parents or Yvette will be thrilled with me if I get trapped in a pot." He then saw Carl laugh and heard the reporter say, "I understand. I've had a few close calls like that. Ever been afraid to fall asleep?" When he shook his head, Carl continued, "I have been. It happened when I was trying to catch a doppelganger that was a firebug. The only safe place one could sleep was in a church." Richard started to wonder which of those stories that he and Yvette had read was the subject of that bit of info, when he heard Michael yell, "Hey, Rich, if you are ready, maybe you can open this door here." He looked over in his friend's direction and saw that he was standing near the door that was in the pyramid. He walked down the steps and quickly tried the handles to the door. He wasn't surprised to see they were locked. He then looked at his friend and said, "Do you think it's a puzzle lock?" He watched as Michael nodded and pressed the star in the center of the door. Soon he saw two panels swing open, revealing 4 sets of 8 squares and various Egyptian symbols. As he looked over it, he heard Michael say, "Something tells me that we need to place the symbols in the right spots, but I'm not sure how." Richard started to go through all the notes he'd gathered from the Egyptian book when he heard Carl say, "You know, that star in the center looks like a compass." When he heard those words, he quickly turned to the page he had put the compass points on. Now that he knew what the solution was, he quickly placed all the panels in their proper spots. When he placed the last panel, he heard the door unlatch, and he opened it. When he stepped in the door, he was stunned at what he saw. "Looks like a movie theater." As he continued into the theater, he heard the others enter. As he continued looking around, he noticed that the movie curtain was closed. He also noticed a podium on one side of the stage. He watched as Carl walked over it, saying, "Looks like this place was designed to educate as well." He then noticed Michael was heading over to the left side of the stage. "You know, this is similar to the one place I'm considering going." He then saw his friend look at him, provided that we get out of here first. Before he could respond to Michael's comment, he heard Carl shout, "I think you better both look over here." He then saw Carl take a picture of the podium and ran up to see what the reporter had found. He looked at the paper on the podium and realized what Carl had found. As he looked at it, he noticed that Michael had stayed at the far end of the stage. He was looking down a hallway as he said, "What is it?" Richard glanced at what he saw again and said, "Notes between the two teens. Apparently they used this place to pass notes while they were avoiding the exupi. However, the one note hints that Beth went someplace she thought was safe." He then looked at the stage and the huge curtain that was in front of the movie screen. It was thick, and he could see there was no room for anyone on the stage. As he looked, he said, "What do you see on that side, Mike?" He wasn't surprised when he heard the response. "Looks like a hall to another room. You two better get over here so we could check it out." He nodded in agreement, and he and Carl joined Michael. Once they were all together, they started down the hall. As they walked, he wondered if something might be hiding behind the curtain. He was so focused on that thought that he briefly noticed a door with several small circles on it. He also noticed a strange rectangular indentation on the one wall. They finally stopped when he noticed Michael was looking up a set of stairs. At the top he could see a wooden door. As he looked at it, one thing came to his mind. He looked to the others and said, "Maybe it's a projection room. We were in a theater, and it would certainly make sense." He then watched as Carl went up and opened the door, and saw his guess about the room was right. He also started to worry. He could see shelves full of film cans, metal film cans. As they stepped inside, he hoped that they wouldn't hear any sounds of the metal exuppy. Carl Kolchak walked into the room, amazed at all the film cans. He continued to the back of the room, between two shelves of films, when he glanced at some of the names on the film cans and quickly realized how much Windlenot believed in. One was titled "The Truth of the Cyclops," while another one was named "Does Scylla and Charybdis Still Exist?" He quickly took off his hat and ran a hand through his hair. Most of his stories were never taken seriously, and this man had managed to get documentary-style films made. He then turned to face the door and speak with the two teens when he noticed they were not with him. His pulse started to race when he saw a very odd shadow going around the corner of the shelves. He quickly ran to the edge of the shelf, shouting, "Look out, you two!" When he turned around the corner, he was stunned by what he saw. Both teens were fiddling at an old film projector, and there was no sign of whatever caused the shadow. He then noticed that Michael kept working at the projector as Richard looked at him and says, "What's wrong, Carl?" Carl walked over to them and looked back towards the door, noticing the huge pile of film cans by the door. "I swore I just saw some sort of monstrous shadow heading this way. Do you think it was one of the exuppy?" He watched as Richard's gaze looked right at the cans. "I don't know, Carl. It would be nice if we could see them sneaking from one place to another." He then watched as Richard motioned back to the projector. Mike noticed something about the projector. "We thought you had followed us to it. It's an old design, but similar to the old models they have at school. It's even loaded with a film. We're trying to figure out how to get started." He watched as Michael rolled up the film. As the boy rolled up the film, he said, "We figured that if we play the movie, the curtain down there will open. It might even stay open." He watched as Michael then looked down and smiled. The boy then said, "Hey, Rich, I think we're ready to roll the film." Carl watched as Richard went back to the machine, and then watched him push a button. Soon he heard the film start to run, and he watched as both boys looked out the window. He joined them and watched as an image of Professor Windlenot appeared on the screen. He watched in stunned silence as Windlenot spoke of an ancient tunnel to an underground world. He continued watching as Windlenot demonstrated opening a strange door. When the film was over, he stood up and said, "Very odd. Why would he want people to watch that?" He watched as Richard stood up and said, "You know, that door looks like a puzzle door we might find here. Maybe that's why it was loaded up." He then watched as the boy looked back to the cans of film behind him. He then followed Richard's glance. He also noticed that Michael was looking at the cans as well. Carl decided to break the eerie silence. "You think an exuppy is in them?" He saw Richard nod. He then heard Michael say, "Let's make a hasty exit then. I don't think any one of us want to be attacked again." He then watched as Michael ran to the door of the room, not stopping until he was through it. He then watched as Richard did the same and quickly followed. As he ran by, he tried to listen for some strange noise, but didn't hear anything. He didn't stop running until they were all at the bottom of the steps. He paused to catch his breath and noticed that the two teens were leaning against the wall. As they stood there, he watched as Michael looked at Richard and said, "You know, Rich, this whole situation is getting more and more unreal. I mean, look at what we are finding and where. It's like a damn game." He watched as Richard looked at his friend and said, "A game? If this is a game, I'm not having any fun. Let's face it, Michael, playing something like this as a game and living it is two different things." He watched as Richard hit the wall with his fist to punctuate his last statement. Carl almost jumped as part of the wall slid away. He then said, "Boys, I think you better calm down. I think you found a secret door." He looked through the opening and said, "It leads to that hall, to the power room." He watched as Richard and Michael looked in the door, and then watched as they both stood up. It was then Michael said, "He's right, Rich. We found a secret door. It might be good to remember this for later." He watched as the other boy nodded, and then watched as Michael looked down the hallway. He followed the gaze, and then headed to the door they had all passed earlier. When he reached the door, he said, "Think we should open it?" He watched as Michael nodded and said, "Yeah. The trick would be to open it. There's no doorknob on it, just those circles with letters on them." He then watched as Richard stepped up to the door and started to turn the circles. As the boy turned them, he said, "It must be set to open with an 8-letter word. There are 8 circles with 4 letters each on them." Carl then remembered the elevator. He looked over at the door and said, "Wait, remember that diagram on the elevator wall? What did you say the word looked like?" He watched as Richard smacked his own head and saw the boy work the dials. Soon, the letters spelling the name of Windlenot's son were lined up, and the door slid open. As they looked in, Carl had a small feeling of dread, since it looked like they would be climbing a circular tower. Michael McNeil couldn't believe what they found. As they stepped inside the door, he looked to the right to see a circular stairway heading up. He started to climb the steps and said, "All right, where do you think we are?" As they climbed, he noticed that at a few points chains were easily visible. The more they climbed, he heard Richard say, "I think we're in the clock tower. Remember the clock we saw when we looked at the museum?" As they continued the climb, he heard Carl say, "I noticed it too, but I didn't hear any chimes. In fact, I don't think I saw the face of the clock change." He thought back and remembered that as well, and then he saw why. He stopped and pointed to a bunch of 5 chains. One of the middle ones was broken. He then said, "That explains the non-functional clock. The one chain is busted." When they all looked, he heard Carl say, "Well, that means we can't hope to hear any time clues from the clock. That would also mean that unless we have watches on, we won't know how much time has passed." He glanced at his wrist and realized he had forgotten his own watch, especially since he didn't plan on being stuck here. He looked at the others and realized they had forgotten their watches as well. He then continued his way up to the top of the tower. When they had reached the top of the stairs, he noticed a small ladder. He started to climb up it, being careful. When he looked into the room above him, he smiled. He then said, Looks like the tower room is a control room. I think I see a control panel. He climbed into the room and walked over to a panel with 12 small monitors and a large monitor. He quickly pushed one button and he saw an image of the elevator they first arrived in. He pushed another button and he saw an image of a hidden hall. He glanced away from the panel and saw that Richard and Carl had entered the room. He watched as Richard walked over to a jukebox that was in the room and started checking all the selections. He also looked over to see Carl was glancing at a bunch of golden heads near a window. He looked at them for a moment and realized where he had seen them before. Before he could say anything, he swore he heard Professor Windlenot's voice. He was glancing over at Richard, and his friend shrugged, saying, "It's this piece about Anansi the spider. Apparently it's a favorite of Windlenot's son." Michael shook his head and said, "Leave that be. Remember that clock we saw in the bedroom? It was a model of the clock tower. Maybe we need to set the clock to the time to turn those heads." He then saw Carl move over to the panel. When the reporter neared the panel, he was stunned to hear Carl say, "Hey, Mike, did you see this? It looks like there's a message in the one room." He ran over to the panel to see the reporter had brought up a screen. He had moved the camera to show 3 words were painted on something. He then watched as Carl wrote down the words and said, "Something tells me that phrase has to do with whatever room that camera is in." Michael smiled and said, "Indeed, I bet one of the cameras is outside as well." He went over to the control and flipped through all the screens. Each one showed a different location, including a room with a strange robot thing in it, and another room showing the strange Exupi symbol. Soon they found a screen that was outside and pointing at the clock. He stopped the camera and said, "Carl, can you keep an eye on the screen? We're going to find out what happens when we set the time properly." He then put his hand on Richard's shoulder and said, "I need you to relay the info." He then went down the ladder and stopped. When Richard was down, he watched his friend look at him. "Mike, what are you up to?" He smiled and said, "You said this wasn't a game, but you also said that Windlenot made the museum to be fun. What if before he died he tried to leave clues about things? Maybe those Exupi had hidden one of the pots in the face with the open mouth. We set the time to the time on the clock. We reveal the pot or the lid of another." He smiled when Richard came to the conclusion. He then heard his friend say, "We set the clock to 5:30 and we get what is hidden." Michael nodded and said, "Right. Now I'm going to the chains. I'll try the first one and then the third one in the line. I'll come up when I'm done." He then ran down the steps and stopped at the chains. He pulled the first chain and heard the clock chime 5 times. He pulled the next chain and didn't hear anything. "Rich, what's the time?" He heard his friend relay the message and then shout back, 5:35. He overshot by 5 minutes. Damn. He pulled the 4th chain and heard the clock chime 5 again. He then looked at the chains. The first set turned the clock 5 hours. The second set turned it 35 minutes. He then stepped back and thought about it. He started to move the chains, ignoring all the chimes. He had to be sure he figured right. When he stopped, he shouted, "What time is it now?" He soon got a response that he was happy with. 4:20. He smiled and pulled the 3rd chain 2 more times. Soon he was rewarded with 2 chimes and heard Rich shout, "You got it right, Mike. Get back up here." He bounded back up the steps and back up the ladder. When he reached the top, he saw Carl taking a picture. The reporter then said, "Good job, Mike. Looks like you even found the crystal exupi pot. He smiled at Carl and said, "So we know another exupi is here." He then started to hear Richard say, "And the fire exupi isn't here. I just found the fire pot." He then watched as his friend opened the pot and saw a female spirit escape from inside. Before any of them could react, he heard the spirit say, "Where am I? Don't tell me I'm dead. He was nuts for bringing these things here." He watched as Richard responded, "I don't think he realized someone would open the pots. One of them got him as well." Michael then saw a somber look cross the girl's face. She then said, "Maybe Merrick shouldn't have opened them. Listen, I was trying to solve one of the riddles. We noticed the pots were shifting all over the place. Some must have been hiding places we hadn't figured to get to. The one riddle I almost solved, but he kept attacking. Solve the puzzle and catch them. It's the only way." He then watched as Carl snapped a picture as the ghost disappeared. He then watched as Richard picked up the pot and said, "Carl, can you put this with the other one we found?" He watched as Carl nodded and placed the pot with the one that had contained Windlenot's spirit. When he was done, he looked at the others and said, "Maybe we should get back to the lobby. We need to figure more things out." He saw the other two nod and then led the way back down to the theater. As they walked, he heard Carl say, "Well, looks like I was right about the fire exupi. I still think the other teen fell victim to wood." As they entered the theater, he heard Richard say, "I'm not sure, Carl. Maybe it was something that was easy to avoid, but easily forgettable. I mean, we've seen a good deal of wood, but what about jade?" Before he could hear Carl's argument, he looked at the stage and saw the curtain was still open. He also noticed something that was at the far end. He walked over to the stage and got on it. He walked over to the object and looked at it again. He saw the shape of the top and smiled. He picked up the pot and said, "Guys, I think we have something to celebrate now." He then held up the pot and smiled more when he saw the pictograph for water on the side of the pot. Now he could get back what the water exupi took from him.